the symbols express a very large variety of things that are difficult to formulate into an explicit set. Now, one of the theories that Jung had about symbols, which I really like, it's different than the Freudian idea. Now, Freud believed that your mind produced symbols to represent content that you repressed, basically. And maybe it does that from time to time. But Jung thought of the symbol in a different way. He thought of it as something that floated up from the depths, so to speak. I actually think that's the right way of thinking about it. Like a dream. Now, we don't really know much about consciousness. It's proved very elusive to scientific study. And we don't really know much about the process by which the understanding of very complex concepts comes about. Although we've started to take that apart to some degree in the class. You're often confronted with things that you don't understand and can't control. And it's necessary to categorize those because you have to figure out how to deal with them. And we've already established the proposition that most human categories that are fundamental are associated with action rather than representation. Or you could think, in some sense, that the action is the representation, right? Which would mean, you might say, well, what's a monster? Or we could even do something simpler. We could say, what's a chair? And I could say, well, a chair could be a beanbag, and a chair could be a stump. And that you might ask, well, a chair and a beanbag and a stump have virtually nothing in common apart from the fact that they're both made out of matter. They're very dissimilar entities, yet you can encapsulate them under the same heading. And the reason for that is because you can sit on them. And so the category is actually predicated on the use. And we've talked about the idea that we categorize things as tools, or that we categorize them in relationship to their implication for action. Now, there were mammalian creatures around between 60 and 220 million years ago, which is a very long time. It's long enough for those mammals to have been overlapping with dinosaurs quite nicely. And, you know, our early ancestors were quite small and easily preyed upon, and then our later ancestors were tree-dwelling primates, and then they were ground-dwelling primates, and now we're city-dwelling primates, you know. And there was a tremendously long period where we were preyed on things that came in from the outside. That's one way of looking at it. And from this perspective, a monster is something that's predatory and that comes out from outside, and that's something you don't expect, and that inhabits unexplored territory, and something that you don't understand. It's all of those things at once. And then, to the degree that the psyche is transpersonal, which means to the degree that your mind is capable, excuse me, that the concepts that your mind uses to organize the world are an expression of a heritable structure, then it's reasonable to propose that you have an inbuilt representation of something like the predator. But it's more complicated in human beings. Now, you might say, well, is there any evidence for that? Because Jung's ideas of archetypes of the collective unconscious has never really been accepted by general psychologists. A lot of biological psychologists are interested in it, by the way, because they're much more familiar with the idea of built-in instinct and action pattern. And instincts and action patterns that are built in can be unbelievably complicated. And we do know, for example, that rats that are never exposed to a cat in their life will still panic if you waft cat odor over their domicile. So rats do not like the smell of cats, and they don't have to learn that. For a long time, psychologists believed that you learn fear through conditioning. And then there was an idea that there were certain fears were prepared so you could learn them more easily. So for example, if I wanted to condition a fear response to you and I showed you a picture of a snake and associated it with a small electric shock, compared to if I associated it with a picture, say, of a daisy or even a pistol, which is also a dangerous thing, obviously, you're going to learn to be conditioned to the snake much faster. So that's sort of the weak version of prepared categorization. But there's stronger versions of prepared categorization too, and I actually think they're correct. And I can't see why they wouldn't be. The stronger version is that, no, you don't have, your apprehension, your alert apprehension, the alert apprehension that you would devote towards something like a predatory reptile is not something that you need to learn at all. You already know how to do it. And I wouldn't say that that's been proven beyond a shadow of a doubt, but, but we do know that chimpanzees react with fear to a variety of stimuli that they didn't necessarily come into contact with during their developmental period. So, for example, chimpanzees don't like bodies of chimpanzees that don't move. So if you bring an anesthetized chimp into a group of chimps in a zoo, say, the chimps are not happy about that at all. They also don't like snakes. They don't like even plastic snakes. And they don't like snakes even if they've never seen a snake. And if they see a snake, and they never have, they'll get the hell away from the snake, but then they'll turn around and look at it, and look at it, and look at it, and look at it. And in the wild, they do something similar. So if a chimp comes across a snake, a big snake, say, it has a particular noise it makes, which is called a snake rah. And I guess that's a representation of the noise that the chimp makes. But what happens when the chimp makes that noise is all the other chimps will come running, and they'll look at the snake. They're sort of enraptured by the snake, I think is the right way to think about it. I think they're in awe of the snake, to tell you the truth. You might think, well, chimpanzees can't feel awe. It's like, well, don't be so sure. You're a modified chimpanzee, and you can feel awe. But there's more to the story than that. You ever listen to a piece of music that makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up? Or a shiver run through you? Is that a familiar experience to people? Has anybody not had that experience? Okay, okay. You're the only person in the whole room. I know. Huh. Okay, well, maybe, whatever. The shiver is a consequence of piloerection. And what that means is that when you have that feeling, you're doing the same thing that a cat does when it puffs out. And the reason that the cat does that is to look big. And the reason it wants to look big is because it sees something that is awe-inspiring. And that's partly, it's an admixture of terror and fascination. Yes, that's the right way of thinking about it. But what's interesting about the piloerection response in human beings is it's often manifested to something of great beauty or great excitement, you know. So anyways, that reaction is so old. My point is that reaction is so old that we still have hangovers, biological hangovers from it, so to speak, from the time when it was actually useful for us to puff up our fur. And that was a long time ago.